What will leaders discuss at this week's NATO meeting in The Hague? Also, former MI6 officer Christopher Steele is going to be telling me how he thinks Russia may react. And former US ambassador to the United Nations John Bolton is going to be joining us, telling us why he thinks Donald Trump chose to act now and whether the president is likely to take much notice of the UN Security Council, which has just announced that they're meeting today. Plus, we're going to be joined by Palestinian chef Sami Tamimi before 4 o'clock. Now, the annual NATO summit kicks off on Tuesday in The Hague, and the meeting is at risk of being overshadowed, of course, by the latest escalation in Iran. So how are the United States and NATO allies feeling about last night's unilateral action in Iran? And is the pressure racketing up on member states to increase their defence spending? Well, to tell us more of what we can expect, we're now joined by General Toorn van Loon, who helped NATO lead the International Security Assistance Force and commanded German and Dutch Corps. General, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon.
What are your thoughts on last night's strikes?
Well, as you already said, it will certainly have an impact on the discussions in The Hague. And to be honest, we knew that something had to be done with the Iranian nuclear program. There was quite a lot of talk about the Americans getting involved, yes or no. And how this will in the end then work out, I would say this is a gamble. But that fits a little bit into the current American administration. It is the way that Donald Trump does business. He goes in big and then sees what happens.
Why do you think this is a gamble?
Well, he's got no idea how the Iranians will react, and he certainly doesn't know what the reaction in the rest of the world will be. The Iranians will certainly look to Moscow, they will look to Beijing and see what happens.
So far, most of the European allies have reacted with urges of de-escalation. However, they have been supportive of those strikes. Does that surprise you?
No, to be honest, it doesn't. As I already said at the beginning, I think the making sure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon is quite valid. There is no that we have to do that, but the way in which it happens without consultation, it will overshadow the NATO summit, but not necessarily in a negative sense. It means we really need to figure out, Europeans, not just how to spend more money on defense, but how to build our own opinion on what we want to do and how we want to do things.
And do you think that there will be a consensus, a unity, if you like, from NATO member states in acting in unison concerning what we've just seen from the US?
I think that's it's not very likely that we will have a very clear, logical message in The Hague on this topic of Iran. I'm pessimistic there. The call for the negotiation table, that's all wonderful. And I think Iran, by the way, the Europeans and the Americans do not disagree on that. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump immediately says, no, we've struck and now we are happy for you to come back to the negotiation table. Well, basically, whipping you back to the negotiation table is what he seems to be doing. That might not be the European way of doing it, but we still want everyone to, look at the wider picture. By the way, the wider picture in the Middle East cannot be seen separate from the other areas in the Middle East where the fighting is also, certainly in the eyes of the Europeans, quite problematic.
Yeah, you're referring to Gaza, of course. And that is a problem, isn't it? Because we've seen, certainly with the UK government has sanctioned to Israeli ministers. We've seen very strong words from the Spanish government when it comes to Israel's actions in Gaza. Is that also likely to come up in this NATO conference?
I wouldn't hold my high hopes for what comes out of this NATO summit. There's a very, very, very large chance that very little comes out of it. Mm-hmm. There's a very small chance that something positive comes out of it, and there's also a small chance of something very negative coming out of it. But the biggest chance is that basically let's try and not get completely off the rails.
What would be the negative outcome that you're referring to?
The negative outcome would be that Donald Trump and the Americans and the Europeans are so much at odds that that NATO itself becomes problematic. That is what Mark Rutte is obviously trying to avoid at all costs. And I think he's right. He needs to try and keep us together. But the biggest problem here is that we Europeans need to realize now that on all topics, and it's not just Ukraine or the Russian threat to Europe, it is all international security related issues. We need to start making up our minds. We need to start playing an equal role on the world stage to actually basically say, okay, wait a second, Gaza. Because it's very easy to condemn someone for what happens in Gaza, but we need to start developing plans what we do want. Currently, we're very good at saying no. We don't want this. We need to figure out what is a yes that we do want, and then go for it. And that is a completely new role for Europe, and it's becoming more and more important. Now, the one policeman of the world has basically said, yeah, but I've had it. I'm not going to do this anymore.
Mm-hmm. Is it a problem, though, that one policeman of the world, referring to Donald Trump, well, at least to the US, is also part of, well, the big part of NATO? If Europe decides, well, do you know what, we've got a different outlook to the United States, then what happens to NATO? Because the US is very much part of NATO.
Yeah, that's true. By the way, as you know, I served in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, most of the time, people talked about US and NATO. Mm-hmm. And that was to some extent okay. We now need to figure out NATO. For mine, it's very simple. The one thing that we need to do, and what actually the NATO summit in The Hague is probably going to go a long way into achieving that, is NATO needs to stand on two legs firmly. Not on one leg, but on two. And these two legs need to be as equal as possible. And sometimes we have security interests that might not be completely aligned. I agree with Donald Trump that if an invasion would take place in the eastern part of Europe, first and foremost, Europe needs to react. And basically rebuilding NATO in a sense that it's not just Article 5. Mm-hmm. It is interesting that we always talk about NATO and then immediately go to Article 5. We need to realize NATO starts with Article 2, which means cooperation and economic collaboration. Then it talks in Article 3 about doing your own thing, closing the door. And then it talks in 4 about consultation, talk to each other, find if your neighbors want to help you. And only then we go to 5, collective defense. And I think that's how you rebuild NATO.
General, another big topic of conversation up until very recently, of course, was Ukraine. Is it in danger of being overshadowed by events in Iran?
Yeah, to some extent it might, because certainly for the Americans it will be. But on the Ukraine, I also firmly believe that the Europeans need to be, and we are picking up the game. The support to Ukraine, Europe has already overtaken America in direct support to the Ukraine. I think we can do more. I think we can do it smarter. We can also very much learn from what Ukraine is doing. Quite a lot of the technology the Ukrainians are now using, the way they fight the Russian enemy, is actually something we could learn from.
And just finally, General, the finances, of course, are going to be on the table. How much the European countries are contributing to their defence spending. This is almost perfect timing for Donald Trump, who's been urging European countries to pay more in their defence spending. Is he on a winning stance, if you like, having the NATO conference straight after such a massive operation from the US?
I think that has very little to do with I think most European nations were very firmly already on board and trying to sign up to a much higher defense spending. I think that was the part that we not completely, but more or less agreed. We all knew that we needed to repair defense. We needed to spend more money to basically have our own defense capabilities, the 3.5%, up to 5% if you include the other security areas. I think that was already almost a done deal. Donald Trump will get, and yeah, he will claim victory for that. By the way, that's fine. Mm-hmm. Marco Rutte has already said that a couple of times. We need to thank Donald Trump because he's making us realize that we need to spend money on defense. Fine.
Just a final question. There have been some suggestions that the shortness of the summit, it's now 2 days long, is due to Donald Trump's short attention span. Is it a good tactic to pander to how Donald Trump likes to work, or should NATO have kept the longer summit that it's used to?
No, I'm okay with the short summit and then let the experts work out the rest. My problem is that we need to make sure that on the rest of the meetings, the experts actually show up. And I think it's not a very good thing that on the Ukraine NATO talks, the American Defense Ministry doesn't show up.
General, thank you for your thoughts. Always good to speak to you.